There are few directors that I respect as much as Denis Villeneuve. For the past decade, he's been consistently making thought-provoking films that challenge us both cerebrally and emotionally. His move into genre filmmaking has brought us two of the greatest sci-fi movies ever made. And with his next film, Dune, just over a year away, I thought I'd go back and take a look at Denis' last 7 films and examine his evolution as a storyteller. Hopefully we can understand the roots of his style and what makes him so revered today amongst fans and critics alike. This movie will probably be the hardest out of the 7 to talk about, mostly because of its heavy subject matter. Though for Denis Villeneuve, a Quebec native, the events in Montreal on December 6, 1989 must hit even closer to home. In fact, Denis was probably attending classes just a few kilometers away when Marc Le Pen entered a cold Polytechnique armed with a rifle. The events of that evening have been etched into the minds of Canadians, and especially Quebecers, ever since. 20 years later, Denis chose to depict that tragic December night in what would turn out to be his most controversial film, 2009's Polytechnique. To be fair to him, I don't think this movie is exploitative in any sense. In fact, I think it works really hard to honor the victims without avoiding the reality that they went through. Shot in black and white, and in both English and French, Denis' meditative filmmaking style is present from the get-go. When asked about his choice to use black and white, Denis said it came from a desire to add distance to the film. In color, things have fallen into a kind of sensationalism. In black and white, it gives us a distance. When working in black and white, everything becomes geometric. Everything becomes mathematical. Here, Villeneuve relies heavily on the dolly shot, using it to invite contemplation with full knowledge of how these quieter moments will be interrupted later on. We see long takes of apartments, of the school's cafeteria, of normal life. Men and women go about their day without a single thought of the looming danger. The film starts off with an unnamed man writing a letter. He talks plain and simple about his hatred for feminism, about how it's driven him to this point. But he reiterates that he's not a madman, instead a rational person who's come to the conclusion that he has to take extreme measures. Denis doesn't give us any more insight into this man's head for the rest of the movie. This is all we have, a note. There's no context, no making of a murder type segment. Denis wants to relay the senselessness of these events without devolving into sensationalism. Instead, he focuses on 2 other characters to combat this as well. Back at École Polytechnique, we follow Valerie as she interviews for an internship as a mechanical engineer. She is accepted, but somewhat unnerved by the interviewer's question of whether or not she wanted to raise a family. She knows that if she told him she wanted to, then she wouldn't have gotten the job. Jean-Francois, the other principal character, isn't given much material beforehand. Instead, we see his brief interaction with Valerie through soft-spoken questions about upcoming assignments. Jean isn't a hero. He's reserved and a bit distant to us. As much as we as an audience enjoy films that pit good versus evil, Denis chose to avoid the usual method of depicting tragedies, such as a framing of the events as a battle between the criminal and the authorities. This is not a portrait of a killer. We are always fascinated by killers. It's easier to make a film about the killer than about the consequences of his actions. The killer is the driving force, the catalyst, but he's not the main character. Marc Le Pen is never named in the movie. During the course of Marc's attack, Denis works really hard to focus on Valerie and Jean. Like I said earlier, Jean is not a hero, and his attempts to help don't stem from confronting the shooter. Instead, he wanders through the school looking for people to help. He helps the victims he comes across, he tells people to run away, but in the end, he's still a civilian. During a section in the film, Jean is caught in a hallway with Mark. This would be the time when the hero confronts the villain, where he has to sacrifice himself for the good of the people. Instead, Jean ducks into a classroom and locks the door. What's striking, though, is that the room he enters is filled with men who have no idea what's happening outside. This mirrors a criticism many had in the wake of this tragedy. Since the primary targets were women, people questioned why the male students didn't try to stop the shooter. Denis depicts these moments when we see an unaware student just crossing paths with Mark without blinking an eye. Despite not being the hero, Jean-Francois is still the most heroic of the bunch. Villeneuve then cuts forward to Jean after the event. His deep sense of guilt is reflected in his apartment. Even when he goes to see his mother, we can still see him wrestling with the idea that he could have done more. We then cut back to Valerie. Even though she survives being shot, she's scared of running back into Mark, so she plays dead, even as Jean passes by looking for survivors. When the authorities finally come, and Valerie is taken away by paramedics, Jean asks for forgiveness.
I'm so sorry, Val. I should have stayed.
Valerie responds by telling him it's not his fault.
It's not your fault.
This is Villeneuve speaking through Valerie. He says about the film, "I wanted to absolve the men. Society condemned them. People were really tough on them. But they were 20 years old. It was as if an alien had landed." When we next see Valerie, she is working as an aeronautical engineer. She also finds out that she's pregnant. In a letter to Marc Le Pen's father, she talks about the fear she faced when confronted by his son, and about the fear she feels now with a child on the way. But Valerie refuses to let that fear take control. As Polytechnique explores the effects such a tragic event can have on the victims, it still champions the good in us. Even for such a heavy film, where the lives of those women on that day seem so cheap, Denis shows us the strength of the human spirit and its ability to endure. So that's Polytechnique. It's a heavy film, but one that encases a lot of what we know as Villeneuve's signature style. His long takes, his focus on mood and atmosphere, the delicacy with which he treats his characters. We'll start to see a lot more of that in the near future.